Okay, great.
Yeah.
Thanks. Right. So, good evening, everyone, and thanks to Santosh and Sushma for the kind invite. My name is Saurajit Iyer, and I work in sustainable finance in consulting and advisory, working essentially with financial institutions across emerging markets. Um, in terms of thematic areas, incidentally, I worked quite some time last few years in sustainable agriculture, in agroforestry, nature-based solutions, deforestation linked agri-commodities, so on and so forth. So I would lean a bit on those experiences at the intersection of agriculture and finance to share some perspectives on the topic that you see, science-based agriculture and green agri-finance, particularly from the perspective of the MSMEs, which is the theme. I'll move to the next slide. One second. Yeah. So the idea, I mean, we often talk that, agriculture needs to become sustainable, but for me, as a finance and business professional, the bigger question is, can we make that sustainable agriculture into investable agriculture? Is it investment ready? It's one thing to say, financial institutions, DFIs, investors should fund these projects, but are they ready in terms of both the investee and the project itself? So investable becomes a very different question. So in that context, when we talk about science-based agriculture, for instance, we are often focusing on practices related to soil health. We are talking about emissions reduction. We are talking about water conservation, biodiversity, so on and so forth. But ultimately, like I said, I mean, how do we make all of these financially investable? So most farmers or agri MSMEs that are operating in developing countries do not, go slow on the uptake of sustainable agri practices because they disagree fundamentally with those practices. They actually they reject them because they are not able to meet the investment requirements per se. In other words, struggling to become finance ready. So adopting a lot of these practices requires investments to come in today, but many of these projects are of a nature where the financial benefit actually occurs through a long gestation period and very long time horizons. That is often beyond the typical investment horizon that most investment or finance entities investing in developing countries are willing to take, because ultimately finance is a fiduciary duty, right? There's a risk return equation. There is a certain horizon to investment horizon to which they are willing to take the risk. When the project's duration far exceeds that mismatch of duration can often lead to a misalignment between finance and the project. So the project may be great. It's just that the finance is not able to match it. So ultimately, what happens is that in this context, science-based agriculture transition is not just to be seen as an environment or climate transition process. It's actually fundamentally a business and finance transition as well, because the investees have to align with how the finance works. And the other way around, I mean, even the finance has to align. Finance has to reorient itself in terms of the instruments, etc., the features of those instruments in order to meet this new generation of climate smart projects. So what happens is that resilience and productivity, sustainability have to translate ultimately into stronger cash flows, into lower investment risks, and which is essentially what we call in investment language as bankability. So better bankability, better financial readiness of the borrowers, only then will the entire system, whether it is the financial institutions, investors, etc., have the ability and the confidence to finance these transitions at scale. And that is why I mean, I would probably say that we should think of this journey not simply as moving from science-based agriculture to sustainable agriculture, but actually from of sustainable or science-based agriculture to investable agriculture. Let me move to the next slide. Yeah. So the question then becomes, basis what we saw in the previous slide on bankability and readiness. So the question then really is that why does conventional finance struggle to meet this, and how can changes in terms of green agri-finance practices help us overcome that? So we're now really talking about the financing challenge. So traditional lending models, like I said, the way most of the instruments that evolved in developing countries context, they are not really designed for many climate smart agriculture investments or projects. So banks now, when these projects come to them, banks often face situations where projects have very long payback periods. They have a lot of uncertainties built in due to weather, climate issues, etc., etc. Supply chains have remained fragmented in most developing countries. In this sector, a lot of farmers are smallholders with limited collateral, very small ticket sizes. At the end of the day, finance is also one of the important variables is the cost of transactions. So the small ticket size becomes an impediment in that context. At the same time, a lot of agri MSMEs that are operating often have seasonal cash flows, and that itself brings a lot of uncertainty, a lot of limited climate-related data to close those climate or weather-related uncertainties. So the result of all of this is that projects which are probably environmentally beneficial from a science perspective are perceived to be very financially risky, and hence are finding it difficult to raise the necessary funding. So the good thing is that we have seen some developments. If you see the middle part of the screen there, we have seen some developments in terms of instruments, financial instruments, and the enablers, what we would call enablers for those instruments. So one of the most relevant financial instruments in the sustainable agri science-based agri nature solutions agroforestry is really outcome-based financing, because you have a lot of outcome claims that can be created from a climate and environment or social standpoint, and that there can be monetized in terms of creating outcome-based financing structures. So a lot of pay for success models or sustainability linked loan models that are coming up in industrial decarbonization can also be superimposed into agriculture. So that's one major area. The other area is on blended finance structures. It's more of a structure rather than an instrument, but essentially to meet those avenues, projects that otherwise would have been, would not have been finance or investable or finance ready in the conventional financing system. What I mean by conventional financing system is the sort of instruments and products that we have by default in the finance sector in developing countries. They are typically those credit risk models and templates are not able to meet those or assess those projects given the risks. So that is where blended finance structures include certain components or credit enhancement tools that then reduces the perceived risks of the projects and making it more amenable to crowd in private sector capital. Other areas being supply chain financing, offtake based financing models that become very relevant, really providing more certainty in terms of future revenue streams, as do aggregation models to combine several small producers, because that's one of the fundamental challenges with agriculture in our type of countries. If you look at the enablers, so again, a lot of because a lot of these technologies, that the projects are built on in climate smart agriculture, they are still evolving. They are not fully proven. The business models are still evolving. and therefore there is a default risk that comes, and then guarantees or first loss default mechanisms as part of credit enhancement becomes very important to improve overall bankability. Previous a couple of speakers back, I think Dr. Henry was mentioning a bit about the digital side. So definitely digital technologies, one of the biggest enablers in this agri space as well. A lot of work around satellite monitoring and digital MRV systems that have come up. In fact, a lot of that connects to outcome-based financing also by making the calculation or the verification of impact or outcome claims more credible. So that then gives more comfort to investors that had lent or funded those financing structures. But perhaps one of the biggest opportunities in terms of the enablers, if I may say, is really the redesign of our conventional lending instruments itself. So credit appraisal processes, a lot of adjustments to loan instrument design needs to evolve. It is started, but a long way to go as yet. But those adjustments are needed in order to recognize, the new age climate smart resilience building investment projects that are there, so that they are able to assess them through the evolved systems and processes, and not just having to say no to those projects because they are using the traditional lending approaches or the lens. The last point I would want to emphasize is, and I'm leaning a lot on the previous projects that I've done in this space. It's not really limited to one crop. These approaches can be superimposed on a number of crops that employ literally millions across developing countries. Whether it is coffee, cocoa, dairy, paddy. A lot of them are export-oriented products, so there is that export linkage variables that play a role as well. So the underlying financing principles per se really remain similar. Let me go to the next slide now. Yeah. So the point I want to emphasize here is really about systems level thinking. So that we should think beyond financing individual farms or projects, but rather the real opportunity is to now think about financing the entire agriculture value chain at a systems level thinking. Farmers require finance at the end of the day. They also require a lot of technical support as far as these climate smart projects are concerned. They want a demand assurance, because even a small volatility in demand of the sustainable variant can cause a lot of pushback at the ground level, at the farm, because farms are, and smallholders become communities. I mean, it's basically you're speaking to several people at one go when you enter a village or a district and speak about a particular intervention. At the same time, if you look at the banks, the next box, so the banks definitely, like we said in the previous slide, they need to build more relevant and better risk assessment methods, aggregation models, and loan instrument products that are more suited with the climate smart agriculture transitions. Buyers, off-takers increasingly need traceable and sustainable supply chain to meet both their customer expectations and the evolving market and regulatory requirements. And last but not the least, governments, etc., have to also play an important role in providing some of the enablers, especially instruments like guarantees, providing supportive policy environment, reducing policy uncertainty, definitely reducing retrospective policy changes, which can create a huge negative impact on the sector's transition, providing access to concessional capital if possible, and overall, better data and digital infrastructure, because the government is often the bearer of a lot of those back-end infrastructure. So when all of these different actors or stakeholders are able to work together, that is when the progress will happen. If they work independently, progress will remain slow. Many times you see that in projects where a particular project may have seen good, thrust, but it remains essentially a project case study. It doesn't transform into a systems level improvement because all the stakeholders may not have been in sync. So it's only when they work together that the risks become more shared, investments become more attractive, and more larger volumes of investment capital can be mobilized. And this systems level approach is really where I personally believe future of green agri-finance lies. Let me move to the final slide now. Yeah. So I mean, if there's a couple of messages I would like to leave all of you with, the future is about financing resilient, science-based agriculture value chains where all the stakeholders that we saw in the previous screen participate in the transition together and not in isolation. And perhaps more importantly, it is important to remember that the transition to science-based agriculture is fundamentally a transition in business and finance. It's not just about environment and climate. Finance cannot remain unchanged, therefore. It has to evolve, just as the investees need to evolve to make themselves more ready. Finance also needs to evolve to make itself more amenable to the new age of climate smart agri value chain projects. That is when we would see a sustainable agriculture truly becoming mainstream rather than just remain a series of pilot projects. I'll end here. Over to you, Sushma. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Sarjit, on your valuable insights on science-based agriculture value chains and green agri-finance. So we learned a lot, and thank you.